All right, finally got it going. All right, welcome to Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice. This is part of the Vampire Chronicles. So let's begin. Yes, the boy said quickly. He was folding his handkerchief over and over it and wiping his lips now with it again. There was a tragedy, the vampire started. It was my younger brother. He died, and then he stopped, so that the boy cleared his throat and wiped at his face again before stuffing the handkerchief almost impatiently into his pocket. "It's not painful, is it?" he asked timidly. "Does it seem so?" asked the vampire. "No." He shook his head. "It is simply that I have only told this story to one other person, and that was so long ago." "No, it's not, Pa. We were living in Louisiana then. We'd received a land grant, and settled 2 indigo plantations on the Mississippi, very near New Orleans." "Ah, that's the accent," the boy said softly. For a moment the vampire stared blankly. "I have an accent?" He began to laugh, and the boy, flustered, answered quickly. "I noticed in the bar when I asked you what you did for a living. It's just a slight sharpness to the consonants, that's all. I never guessed it was French." "It's all right," the vampire assured him. Ran not as shocked as I pretend to be. "It's only that I forget from time to time. But let me go on, please," said the boy. "I was talking about the plantations. They had a great deal to do with it, really, my becoming a vampire. But I'll come to that. Our life there was both luxurious and primitive, and we ourselves found it extremely attractive. You see, we live far better than we could have ever lived in France. Perhaps the sheer wilderness of Louisiana only made it seem so. But seeming so, it was. I remember the important furniture that cluttered the house." The vampire smiled. "And the harpsichord that was lovely. My sister used to play it. On summer evenings she would sit at the keys with her back to the open French windows, and I can still remember that thin rapid music, and the vision of the swamp rising beyond her, the moss-hung cypresses floating against the sky. And there were sounds of the swamp, a chorus of creatures, the cry of the birds. I think we loved it. It made the rosewood furniture all the more precious, the music more delicate and desirable. Even with the wisteria tore the shutters of the attic windows, and worked its tendrils right into the whitewashed brick in less than a year. Yes, we loved it. All except my brother. I don't think I ever heard him complain of anything, but I know how he felt. My father was dead then, and I was head of the family, and I had to defend him constantly from mother and sister. They wanted to take him visiting and to New Orleans for parties, but he hated these things. I think he stopped going altogether before he was 12. Prayer was what mattered to him. Prayer and his leather-bound lives of the saints. Finally, I built him an oratory removed from the house, and he began to spend most of every day there, and often the early evening. It was ironic, really. He was different from us, so different from everyone, and I was so regular. There was nothing extraordinary about me whatsoever." The vampire smiled. "Sometimes in the evening I would go out to him and find him in the garden near the oratory, sitting absolutely composed on a stone bench there. and I'd tell him my troubles, the difficulties I had with the slaves, how I distrusted the overseer or the weather or my broker, all the problems that make up the length and breadth of my existence. And he would listen, making only a few comments, always sympathetic, so that when I left him, I had the distinct impression he had solved everything for me. I didn't think I could deny him anything, and I vowed that no matter how it would break my heart to lose him, he could enter the priesthood when the time came. Of course, I was wrong. The vampire stopped. For a moment the boy only gazed at him, and then started as if awakened from a deep thought, and he floundered as if he could not find the right words. Allie, he didn't want to be a priest, the boy asked. The vampire studied him as if trying to discern the meaning of his expression. Then he said, I meant that I was wrong about myself, about my not denying him anything. His eyes moved over the far wall and fixed on the panes of the window. He began to see visions. Interesting. Real visions? The boy asked, but again there was a hesitation. As if he were thinking of something else. I don't think so, the vampire answered. It happened when he was 15. He was very handsome then. He had the smoothest skin and the largest blue eyes. He was robust, but not thin as I am now, and I was then. But his eyes. It was as if when I looked into his eyes, I was standing alone on the edge of the world. On a windswept ocean beach, there was nothing but the soft roar of the waves. Well, he said, his eyes still fixed on the window panes. He began to see visions. He only hinted at this at first, and he stopped taking his meals altogether. He lived in the oratory. At an hour of a day or night, I could find him on the bare flagstones kneeling before the altar, and the oratory itself was neglected. He stopped tending the candles or changing the altar clothes or even sweeping out the leaves. One night I became really alarmed when I stood in the rose arbor watching him for 1 solid hour, during which he never moved from his knees, never once lowered his arms, which he held outstretched in the form of a cross. The slaves all thought he was mad. The vampire raised his eyebrows in wonder. I was convinced that he was only overzealous, that in his love for God he had perhaps gone too far. Then he told me about the visions. Both Saint Dominic and the Blessed Virgin Mary had come to him in the oratory. They had told him he was to sell our property in Louisiana, everything we owned, and use the money to do God's work in France. My brother was to be a great religious leader, to return to the country to its former fervor, to turn the tide against atheism and the revolution. Of course, he had no money of his own. I was to sell the plantation, our town houses in New Orleans, and give the money to him. Again the vampire stopped, and the boy sat motionless, regarding him, astonished. Allie, excuse me, he whispered. What did you say? Did you sell the plantations? No, said the vampire. His face calm. It had been from the start. I laughed at him, and he became incensed. He insisted his His command came from the Virgin herself. Who was I to disregard it? Who indeed? He asked softly, as if he were thinking of this again. Who indeed? And the more he tried to convince me, the more I laughed. It was nonsense, I told him, the product of an immature and even morbid mind. The oratory was a mistake, I said to him. I would have torn it down at once. He would go to school in New Orleans and get such insane notions out of his head. I don't remember all that I said, but I remember the feeling. Behind all this contemptuous dismissal on my part was a smoldering anger and disappointment. I was bitterly disappointed. I didn't believe him at all. But that's understandable, said the boy quickly, when the vampire paused, an expression of astonishment softening. I mean, would anyone have believed him? Is it so understandable? The vampire looked at the boy. I think perhaps it was vicious egotism. Let me explain. I loved my brother, as I told you, and at times I believed him to be a living saint. I encouraged him in his prayer and meditations, as I said, and I was willing to give him up to the priesthood. And if someone had told me of a saint in Aries or Lourdes who saw visions, I would have believed it. I was Catholic. I believed in saints. I lit tapers before their marble statues in churches. I knew their pictures, their symbols, their names, but I couldn't believe my brother. Not only did I not believe his visions, I couldn't entertain the notion for a moment. Now why? Because he was my brother. Holy he might be, peculiar most definitely, but Francis of Assisi? No, not my brother. No brother of mine could be such. That is egotism. Do you see? The boy thought about it before he answered, and then he nodded and said that yes, he thought he did. Perhaps he saw visions. Excuse me. All right. Said the vampire. Then you didn't claim to know? Now, whether he did not. No, but I do know that he never wavered in his conviction for a second. That I know now, and knew then the night he left my room, crazed and grieved. He never wavered for an instant. Within minutes he was dead. How? The boy asked. He simply went out the French doors onto the gallery and stood for a moment at the head of the brick stairs, and then he fell. He was dead when I reached the bottom, his neck broken. The vampire shook his head in consternation, but his face was still serene. Did you see him fall? Asked the boy. Did he lose his footing? Chapter 2. No. But the two servants saw it happen. They said that he looked up as if he had just seen something in the air. Then his entire body moved forward as if being swept by a wind. One of them said he was about to say something when he fell. I thought that he was about to say something too, but it was at that moment I turned away from the window. My back was turned when I heard the noise. He glanced at the tape recorder. I could not forgive myself. I felt responsible for his death, he said, and everyone else seemed to think I was responsible also. But how could they? You said they saw him fall. It wasn't a direct accusation. They simply knew that something had passed between us that was unpleasant, that we had argued minutes before the fall. The servants had heard us. My mother had heard us. My mother would not stop asking me what had happened and why my brother, who was quiet, had been shouting. Then my sister joined in, and of course I refused to say. I was so bitterly shocked and miserable that I had no patience with anyone. Only the vague determination that would not know about his visions. They would not know that he had become, finally, not a saint, but only a fanatic. My sister went to bed rather than face the funeral, and my mother told everyone in the parish that something horrible had happened in my room, which I would not reveal, and even the police questioned me, on the word of my own mother. Finally, the priest came to see me and demanded to know what had gone on. I told no one. It was only a discussion, I said. I was not on the gallery when he fell, I protested, and they all stared at me if as if I'd killed him. And I felt that I'd killed him. I sat in the parlor beside his coffin for 2 days thinking, I have killed him. I stared at his face until spots appeared before my eyes and I nearly fainted. The back of his skull had been shattered on the pavement, and his head had the wrong shape on the pillow. I forced myself to stare at it, to study it, simply because I could barely endure the pain and the smell of decay, and I was tempted over and over to try to open his eyes. All these were mad thoughts, mad impulses. The main thought was this. I had laughed at him. I had not believed him. I had not been kind to him. He had fallen because of me. Yes, said the vampire, looking at him without surprise. I want to go on telling you, but as his eyes passed over the boy and returned to the window, he showed only a faint interest in the boy, who seemed engaged in some silent inner struggle. But you said you didn't know about the visions, that you, a vampire, didn't know for certain whether. I want to take things in order, said the vampire. I want to go on telling you things as they happen. No, I don't know about the visions. To this day, and again, he waited until the boy said, yes, please go on. Well, I want to sell the plantations. I never wanted to see the house or the oratory again. I leased them finally to an agency which would work them for me and manage things so I need never go there. And I moved my mother and sister to one of the townhouses in New Orleans, of course. I did not escape my brother. For a moment, I could think of nothing but his body rotting in the ground. He was buried in the St. Louis Cemetery in New Orleans. And I did everything to avoid passing those gates, but still I thought of him constantly. Drunk or sober, I saw his body rotting in the coin, and I couldn't hear it. Over and over I dreamed that he was at the head of the steps, and I was holding his arm, talking kindly to him, urging him back into the bedroom, telling him gently that I believed him, that he must pray for me to have faith. Meantime, the slaves on Point du Lac, that was my plantation, had begun to talk of seeing his ghost on the gallery, and the overseer couldn't keep order. Perhaps in society asked my sister a sense of questions about the whole incident, and she became an hysteric. She wasn't really an hysteric. She simply thought, who had no courage to do it himself. I walked the black streets and alleys alone, I passed out in cabarets. I backed out of the 2 duels more from apathy than cowardice, and truly wished to be murdered. And then I was attacked. It might have been anyone, and my invitation was open to sailors, thieves, maniacs, anyone. But it was a vampire. He caught me just a few steps from my door one night and left me for dead, or so I thought. You mean he sucked your blood? The boy asked. Yes, the vampire laughed. He sucked my blood. That is the way it's done. But you lived, said the young man. You said he left you for dead. Well, he drained me almost to the point of death, which was for him sufficient. I was put to bed as soon as I was found, confused and really unaware of what had happened. I suppose I thought that the drink had finally caused a stroke. I expected to die now, and had no interest of eating or drinking or talking to the doctor. My mother sent for the priest. I was feverish by then, and I told the priest everything, all about my brother's visions and what I had done. I remember I clung to his arm, making him swear over and over he would tell no one. I know I didn't kill him, I said, the priest finally. It's that I cannot live now that he's dead. Not after the way I treated him. That's ridiculous, He answered me. Of course you can live. There's nothing wrong with you but self-indulgence. Your mother needs you, not to mention your sister, and as far as the brother of yours, he was possessed of the devil. I was so stunned when he said this, I couldn't protest. The devil made the visions. He went on to explain the devil was rampant. The entire country of France was under the influence of the devil, and the revolution had been the greatest triumph. Nothing would have saved my brother but exorcism, prayer, and fasting, men to hold him down while the devil raged in his body and tried to throw him about. The devil threw him down the steps. It's perfectly obvious, he declared. You weren't talking to your brother in that room. You were talking to the devil. Well, this enraged me. I believed before that I had been pushed to my limits, but I had not. He went on talking about the devil, about the voodoo amongst the slaves, the causes of possession in other parts of the world. I went wild. I wrecked the room in the process of nearly killing him. But your strength, the vampire asked the boy. I was out of my mind, the vampire explained. I did things I could not have done in perfect health. The scene is confused, pale, fantastical now, but I do remember that I drove him out of the back doors of the house, across the courtyard, and against the brick of the kitchen, where I pounded his head until I nearly killed him. When I was subdued finally, and exhausted then, almost to the point of death, they bled me, the fools, but I was going to say something else. It was then that I conceived of my own egotism. Perhaps I had seen it reflected in the priest. Oh no. And that is where we have to stop for the day. Okay. So on Monday we will continue reading Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. Oh, yes. This is going to be interesting and fun. I haven't read this since I was a teenager. Okay. And I had plenty of time to read at the time because I was a security guard. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, enough of that story. So, I've always wanted to read a vampire book that had Lost Boy vibes, and Fear Street, and a little bit of teen romance. So what I do? I wrote one. It's called Vampire Juice. Amanda and Sean stumble upon a mysterious can of juice while searching for Halloween costumes at a local store. Despite being kicked out by the sales clerk, they become obsessed with uncovering the truth behind the strange drink. With the help from some local police, they sneak back into the store through a crypt in the graveyard, only to find themselves in the midst of a spine-chilling adventure. So, if that sounds something that interests you, my link is in the bio. Thank you for watching, and on Monday we will continue reading Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice, the master of storytelling. Oh, yes, she is.